Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. My guest today is Robert Wood, who is the U.S. ambassador to the Conference on Disarmament. He joins us from Geneva. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Mr. Ambassador, obviously nuclear security is making headlines, especially in the Korean Peninsula. We're seeing North Korea launching missiles, conducting nuclear tests, and despite the threats, despite the sanctions, it seems nothing will stop North Korea. How worrying is it for the world?
Well, our hope is that the international community will fully implement existing sanctions on North Korea. We have to exhaust every diplomatic option we have to try to get North Korea to change course. It's going down a very dangerous path, and the international community needs to be concerned.
But how do you deal with such a country that seems essentially deaf to all those threats, including from allies like China?
Well, it's a difficult challenge that we have, but we think that by putting more pressure on the regime in Pyongyang, and this is where China can play a very important role. China has very, very unique leverage with North Korea, and it needs to use that leverage. And we think that if we can put sustained diplomatic pressure on North Korea, it will have no choice but to live up to its obligations under Security Council resolutions. But you know, sanctions may not work, but we do think that there's still an opportunity for diplomacy. And what we're calling on is for all countries to implement the sanctions very forcefully and very completely. So, but again, we don't know if that's going to work with North Korea. This regime seems intent on getting a nuclear weapons capability, an ICBM capability that can certainly reach the United States with a nuclear warhead attached. And so this is of great concern, not only to my country, but to many countries around the world.
Right. Another country where nuclear weapons, or at least a nuclear program, has been a worry is Iran. Obviously, the Obama administration and European countries signed an agreement with Iran. The Trump administration is having serious issues with that deal and could decide maybe to exit this deal and not certify that Iran is complying. How much of a concern is it that Iran is complying or not with that agreement? The International Atomic Energy Agency says Iran is indeed complying.
Well, one has to take a look at the entire picture, and that's why we in the administration are undergoing a full and comprehensive review of Iran policy. The JCPOA will be one piece of that. And so what we have to insist on is strict adherence by Iran to its obligations. But, you know, there are concerns that we have about the fact that there are hundreds of sites in Iran that are off limits, basically, to the IAEA. And so it's really hard to really make a very firm determination about, you know, whether or not they're complying if the inspectors don't have access they need to the necessary sites. So again, our policy right now with regard to the JCPOA and Iran in general is under review. So we'll have to see where all of this ends up. But we have some very, very serious concerns about Iran's compliance. And not only that, but with Iran's behavior throughout the Middle East.
Right, but if the IAEA says Iran is complying, if the IAEA has been able to conduct many inspections, you still have a doubt about Iran's true intentions and actually true activities in the nuclear arena. Is that correct?
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, the agency, the IAEA, needs access to some of these suspicious sites. And having spent time at the U.S. mission to international organizations, one of which is the IAEA, we have seen how Iran will basically dither, say one thing, do another, and play games with the agency. And I think we in the international community need to provide strong support to the IAEA so that it can do its job. But again, it's not going to be able to do its job properly unless it gets access to many of these suspicious sites. And so it's very hard, as I said, to be able to determine that Iran is fully complying if you don't have access to sites where you think there may be some activity going on.
Right. More broadly, I want to get to the so-called Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty that was adopted this July by 122 countries. This treaty will be open for signature very soon on September the 20th in New York. And before entering into international law, it would need to be ratified by 50 states. Obviously, all the countries bearing or hosting nuclear arms boycotted those negotiations. I imagine the US, as well as countries like France and the UK, are totally opposed to that treaty. Why would you be opposed to a nuclear ban treaty?
Well, thank you for your question. First and foremost, the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty will not advance nuclear disarmament. It will not reduce nuclear weapons stockpiles around the world by one single weapon. And we've made that very clear. We've made our opposition clear from the very beginning that this treaty, that I do expect will enter into force on September 20, will not do anything to further nuclear disarmament. All it will do is basically create a further exacerbate a very serious international security environment. And so what we have said, what the United States has said, is that we are committed to upholding our obligations under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, Article 6, which calls on good faith negotiations on nuclear disarmament. And the United States has reduced its strategic nuclear weapons stockpile by 87% since the treaty came into effect. And I think that is a clear, that should show very clearly to the world that the United States has made a good faith effort toward nuclear disarmament. So again, I think this ban treaty, again, will not take forward nuclear disarmament, and it will only make discussions about nuclear issues so much more complicated going forward in the future.
But why have a vast number of countries, 122, as I was saying, sign onto this treaty if it's not going to help nuclear disarmament? Some are saying that treaties calling for the ban of landmines, of chemical weapons, sometimes were not agreed to by major powers. But in the end, after several years, it did make a difference. Why would this treaty be different?
Well, first and foremost, in referring to the landmines treaty, cluster munitions treaties, the Biological Weapons Convention, all countries agreed at the beginning that they wanted to eliminate these weapons. And so that is the major difference here. The nuclear weapon states and other nuclear weapons possessing states, such as India and Pakistan, and then those countries that rely on nuclear weapons for their security, are very concerned about this treaty's impact on nuclear deterrence. And so they're apples and oranges in comparing. So this ban treaty, assuming it enters into force, is really, in my view, nothing more than a political statement. It will not affect nuclear disarmament. If you do not have those countries that possess nuclear weapons joining that treaty, how do you, in a practical way, how does it move forward nuclear disarmament?
Right, but there was a kind of bargain when the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was entered into force in the 1960s, is that there would be nuclear cooperation between the nuclear powers and those that do not have nuclear power. And those countries are saying, well, the bargain was really never there, and that therefore there is something missing to the current situation, which explains why a number of countries are saying, well, let's ban the weapons once and for all.
Well, there's a certain frustration in the disarmament community about the pace of nuclear disarmament over the last decade or so. And one of the things we have made clear is that you cannot separate the prevailing international security environment from nuclear disarmament. The current security climate is not conducive for further nuclear disarmament, at least at this point. When you have what Russia and China are modernizing their strategic nuclear forces at a very rapid rate, when you have the situation with regard to North Korea, this is not a time to talk about further nuclear disarmament. We have to deal with the greatest challenge, nuclear challenge, that the world has faced in some time, and that's the efforts and activities of the regime in Pyongyang. And so it is so important to understand that you cannot divorce nuclear disarmament from the prevailing security environment. And that was understood at the time of the writing of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's why there was not a time frame put on eventual disarmament, because there was the understanding that you obviously had to deal with the prevailing security climate. And again, I would point you back to to the percentage of reductions that we've had over the last 50 years since the treaty, in essence, came into force. An 87% reduction. That, as I've said, is a good faith example of the United States' commitment to nuclear disarmament.
Right. In a nutshell, just to conclude, in a way, Kim Jong-un might be your best ally to fight that nuclear ban treaty.
Well, one of the things that we've learned from this whole process with regard to the ban treaty and North Korea is that the ban treaty does not in any way solve the biggest nuclear challenge we face, and that is North Korea right now. So what we have said we want to do is we want to try to ensure that the Korean Peninsula is stable and denuclearized. And right now, North Korea is unfortunately exacerbating tensions on the peninsula and frankly around the world.
Ambassador Wood, thank you. That's all we have time for. And thank you for watching this interview here on France 24. Stay tuned for more news.
People and Profit, presented by Stephen Carroll.
Business news is not about numbers, nor percentages and statistics. Business news is about people and how we live our lives. People and Profit goes beyond numbers to analyze how the global flow of money and profits shape our world. Intelligent and accessible, the show cuts across business, economics and politics.
People and Profit, on France 24 and France24.com.